Hello, my dear students. Now it's time to go forward and go on proceeding more in our novel. And we're going to start by chapter 3. It's called The Wine Shop. Setting, we are in 1775 in Paris, in France. And we're going to go to Saint Antoine Street, in which we have the wine shop of Monsieur and Madame Defarge, a garret, a room over a building where Dr. Manette was staying under the guidance or protection of Monsieur Defarge. Characters, we're going to have Monsieur and Madame Defarge, the Jacks, Dr. Manette, Gaspard. Gaspard is one of the most famous Jacks ever, and I want you to memorize his name quite well. Charles Darnay, or we're going to call him Charles Darnay because names have no rules. He's one of the major characters. We're going to know more about him in that chapter because it's going to be more beneficial in chapter 4. Monsieur Defarge, he was a wine shopkeeper, like he owns, a shop. He was bull-necked, someone very strict, He was about 30 years old. He wasn't wearing a coat. His sleeves, that's his sleeves, were rolled up, okay? He was a dark man, in complexion. He was good-eyed, decisive, leader of the Jacks. How about Madame Defarge, his own wife? Madame Defarge was about almost his own age. She was good observant, like she has watchful eyes, She seldom did any mistakes. She is always knitting. And here we have a sort of knitting pictures. Knitting, okay? And preparing for the French Revolution with the help of the Jacks and her husband. Before we're going to carry on, that kind of a knitting, it's like her own memory. She kept knitting, okay, the first initials of people who are going to be killed or executed during the French Revolution. So that's why, let's say, she's going to execute, let's say, for example, Laurie. So she's going to knit the first letter, which is L. So in her knitting, you're going to find L, N, K. Each and every letter stands for a person. Dr. Manette, an old man, we said before, almost erect, loss of memory. He could identify himself, like he know himself, but the number of his cell, 105 North Tower. He couldn't remember Mr. Laurie or Monsieur Defarge. He was a shoemaker, just making shoes, as he learned this in prison itself. He was white-haired man, okay? He imagined that he was still in prison and not in a garret. Charles Darnay, or like we call him Charles Darnay. Charles Darnay his real name was Charles Evremond. And Evremond, it was one of the most famous aristocratic French family. It was very cruel, okay, brutal. He had changed his name from Charles Evremond to be Charles Darnay. You're gonna know why later on. He was one of the French aristocrats. He was a French citizen who was living in England, working as a French teacher. He disowned his family, as his family's name was completely hated all over France. He was a kind gentleman who was completely honorable. He had sometimes to travel to France because of some kind of family matters. When his father died, okay, his uncle, the Marquis is a title, not a name of someone, like we see like a lord or a nobleman. The twin brother of his father brought him up. He would meet Lucy, Miss Pross, Dr. Manette, and of course Mr. Laurie for the first time on the boat going back from France to England. Let me describe and give you more knowledge about Saint Antoine Street. Saint Antoine Street is one of the most poorest section ever in Paris or ever in France. Like a suburb, like a slum, okay? It was filled with a lot of hunger, poverty, misery, and sickness. The street was completely dirty, and people who lived there were completely uneducated, hungry, cold, died because of starvation, they were sick, and they were like kind of wild animals because of lack of food. When the French Revolution would break out, would start, the blood of the aristocrats would flow like wine in that street Saint Antoine. So the street Saint Antoine itself would be like the headquarters for the French Revolution. It is the place where the French Revolution would start. The main ideas in that chapter, you're going to have the broken cask of wine in Saint Antoine and its symbolism. Cask is like a kind of a large container. I'm going to show you a picture for a cask. The reaction of the poor people of Saint Antoine after the cask of wine had been smashed, like destroyed or broken into small pieces. How Monsieur Deforge introduced Miss Tallari to Dr. Manette. The first encounter between Lucy and her father for the first time. The decision to bring Dr. Manette from France to England. Before we start, let me tell you one idea. Lucy, she looked like her mom. Her mom, she used to have a long golden hair and blue eyes. And Lucy, she looked like her mom, definitely like her mom. Mr. Laurie and Lucy Manette, they arrived at the wine shop of Monsieur and Madame Deforge. Let's imagine that here's the wine shop. So we have a lot of tables. In one of the tables, we have Lucy Manette and Mr. Laurie. Waiting for who? Waiting for Monsieur Deforge. In another table, we have some kind of the jacks. They were almost like 3 jacks, playing cards and drinking wine and pretending to be regular or normal customers. At the counter, we have Madame Deforge, and she was knitting as usual. How about Monsieur Deforge? Monsieur Deforge was standing outside the wine shop because we have like a cart full of casks of wine. So the workers were transferring the cask of wine from the cart itself inside the wine shop. So he was witnessing the whole scene until one of the workers accidentally, like this, by mistake, he dropped the cask of wine. So the cask of wine had been smashed into pieces, and the wine, which has the red color, kept on flowing in the narrow street of Saint Antoine. Let's see the reaction of the poor class. Monsieur Deforge was outside the wine shop, here it is, witnessing some workers transferring some casks of wine inside the wine shop until one of them had been dropped and smashed into small pieces by mistake. Okay? All people on the street, because they are from the poor class, they stopped, suspended what they were doing, and keep on running to drink the wine. Okay? Some of them knelt when you kneel on your own knees, okay? Putting their hand together and keep on sipping each drop of wine. Others, they kept licking, you lick by your own tongue, the wine from the ground. And of course, the wine is mixed with a sort of kind of a mud. Even mothers, they put some kind of rags, like a small piece of cloth, in the wine, and squeeze the wine in the mouth of their own children. It was a kind of celebration, okay? To these kind of people living in hunger, poverty, and misery, the wine was like a blessing from heaven. Who was witnessing the whole scene? He was Monsieur Deforge. Okay, here it is. That's a cask, container of wine, and here we are inside the wine shop. And here is one of our most famous jacks. His name is Gaspard. What's the word blood? I'm going to tell you right now. Across the street, there was the wine shop owned by Monsieur Deforge, who was watching, like we said, the people struggling for the wine. He said that it wasn't his own fault, and people from the market should bring him another one. Until Gaspard, one of the jacks, he put his finger down in the wine and he wrote on one of the walls of the street the word blood. Who saw him? Monsieur Deforge, his leader. He ran toward Gaspard and he took a handful of mud and he erased the word blood and he called him, "Are you mad, Gaspard? Still too early." Too early for what? For the French Revolution. Okay? The whole scene of the broken cask of wine, it has like a significance. What is it? Let's read. Here it is. The scene was a symbol of the blood that would be spilled in the street in France during the French Revolution. The mob gathered around the wine in the same way they would gather around the blood of the aristocrats. Dickens shows the terrible suffering of the French people at the hands of the aristocrats. Also, the word blood written by Gaspard, it refers to the blood of who? The blood of the aristocrats. That will happen when the French Revolution would break out. Monsieur Dufarge, he crossed the street, okay, and he entered his own wine shop, and he ignored the table of Lucy and Mr. Lorry. His wife, Madame Dufarge, she kept giving him like a signal, coughing, like coughing for him, okay? Like she's asking him to go and talk to Mr. Lorry and Lucy. But what did he do? He ignored, pretended he didn't see Lucy and Mr. Lorry, and he went to the Jacks, let's say the table of the Jacks, and they kept talking, okay, about the glass of wine, about the reaction of the poor class, and so on. After a while, Mr. Lorry, he went to Monsieur Dufarge and talked to him, and Monsieur Dufarge, he said willingly. Willingly for what? Like, okay, let me show you the place of Dr. Alexander Manette. That part will be found in your novel on pages 24 and 25. They kept going, Monsieur Dufarge and Mr. Lorry, as well as Lucy Manette, to a kind of a building, okay? We have like stairs. Before they're gonna climb the stairs, Monsieur Dufarge, he bent down on his knees and he kissed Lucy's hand. Okay, he told her that her father has totally changed. They kept like going, mountaining up the stairs. The first one, Monsieur Dufarge, the second one, Mr. Lorry, and the last one was Lucy Manette. Okay, until they reached like the top of the stairs itself. There was a kind of a door. So Monsieur Dufarge, he took out from his own pocket keys. Okay, which means that Monsieur Dufarge, he had to lock up Dr. Manette in his own garret, who was completely amazed, Mr. Lorry. So to Mr. Lorry's amazement, he was informed that Dr. Manette had to be locked in the garret for his own safety. The dialogue kept on going between Mr. Lorry and Monsieur Dufarge, okay, in a very low voice, so that not one single word will be heard by Lucy Manette. Here is the dialogue itself from the novel. Let's read it. You think it's necessary to keep the unfortunate gentleman looked up? That's Mr. Lorry talking. I think it's necessary to turn the key. That's Monsieur Dufarge. Why, Mr. Lorry? Why? Because he has lived so long locked up that he would be frightened, tear himself to pieces, die, come to I know what harm if this door was left open. That's Monsieur Dufarge talking. At that time, Lucy, she started to be somehow anxious and worried, but Mr. Lorry gave her like a comfort, was a supporter to her. And they were about to unlock the door of the garret where Dr. Manette was staying. They found the three Jacks who were drinking wine, trying to take a look or catch a glimpse of Dr. Manette from the cracks of the wall, because the garret was a kind of a room, okay, and the wall was completely like somehow broken, so there was a kind of a cracks, like holes. So they were trying to look at Dr. Manette from the cracks of the walls. Who got somehow furious? He was Mr. Lorry. And he even asked Monsieur Dufarge, are you making a show out of Dr. Manette? Monsieur Dufarge, he gave like signals, orders, restrictions for the Jacks to leave at once. And they left, carrying out the orders of Monsieur Dufarge. When they left, Monsieur Dufarge, he said, they are well-chosen men, and the sight of Dr. Manette would do them good. Okay, Mr. Lorry couldn't understand. Monsieur Dufarge, he meant that the sight of Dr. Manette would trigger their hearts, fill their hearts, with more kind of anger, and they would insist on having the French Revolution to bring back justice and equality and so on. As the door was open of the garret, Lucy was standing outside. She couldn't enter. Who entered? It was Monsieur Dufarge as well as Mr. Lorry. Monsieur Dufarge first, and he kept giving like a signal by his hand to Mr. Lorry to come. Okay, Dr. Manette was sitting on a kind of a bench, stooping over, making shoes. His own face was to the window and his back to the door. Okay. Monsieur Dufarge entered the garret and greeted Dr. Manette, who was busy making shoes. Monsieur Deforge informed Dr. Manette that he had a visitor, someone who come to see him, someone who could differentiate between good shoe and a bad shoe. Okay, here is Dr. Manette working. Deforge asked Dr. Manette to tell Mr. Lorry what kind of shoe he was making and the shoemaker name. Dr. Manette said it was a walking lady shoe. Yeah, it's a shoe for ladies to keep on walking. And I made it. And he said that with kind of pride. He was so proud of himself. When he was asked and the shoemaker name, Dr. Manette said, "Are you asking about my name?" They said yes. He said, "My name is 105 North Tower." That's the number of his cell in prison. Okay, here it is. Deforge asked Dr. Manette to tell Mr. Lorry what kind of shoe he was making and the maker's name. After a long pause, Dr. Manette replied by saying that it was a lady walking shoe. When Mr. Lorry asked Dr. Manette about his name, he replied 105 North Tower. That was the number of his cell in which he had been imprisoned for 18 years. And that was the name that he only knew himself by during his long stay. At that part, Lucy, she entered and she kept like crying. She kept crying somehow, okay? When she tried to keep on sitting beside him, beside Dr. Manette, he just moved back, called back because he was completely afraid of her. He imagined at first that she might be the daughter of the jailer, okay? And then he began to feel somehow comfortable toward Lucy Manette. When he saw Lucy golden hair, he imagined that Lucy, she might be his own wife, okay? Around his neck was a kind of like a small box. He opened the box and he found a small quantity of golden hair. He kept comparing between the hair and Lucy's hair, okay? And then he recalled back memories of the day in which he was taken to prison. He said, "She had laid her hand upon my shoulder, her head. That night when I was summoned up, she had fear of my going, though I had none." He was talking about his own wife somehow. After a long pause, he put his hand over his head and he said, no, it can't be. Why it can't be? Because she is too young, Lucy, and I am too old. And then he asked Lucy Manette about her own name. Lucy, she said, "I will tell you about my name and my family name, but not here." And she meant by not here, not in France. She held her father in her own arms like a kind of a child, and she kept like rocking him, okay? It was arranged that Dr. Manette would leave France, okay, at once going back to England. Lorry and Mr. Deforge, they had arranged for everything, including the garments, the food, the carriage. When Madame Deforge was knitting in the street, watching everything, when the doctor got anxious and asked for his tools, I mean, once the doctor, they went downstairs in the carriage, okay, Dr. Manette became somehow furious and angry. He said, where are my shoes? Where are my bench? And so on. So Madame Deforge, she hurried up to the garret and she went downstairs and she bring him his shoes, his tools, and his own bench. At that time, he felt somehow calm and the carriage started going on. They were about to move from Calais to take a boat to Dover, where they're going to meet, as we said before, Charles Darnay, and then inside England to settle there forever. Well, thank you all, my dear students, and that's all for the chapter.